It's a pleasure, as always, to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered access to justice for vulnerable people. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak on what is an increasingly critical issue: access to justice, particularly for those who, for whatever reason, would otherwise be left without legal redress. On this side of the House, we recognise the fundamental importance of legal aid in ensuring that everyone has access to justice. It's a significant time for legal aid, and today marks the inaugural meeting of the Bach Commission, led by my colleagues Lord Willie Bach and the member for Kingston upon Hull East. This commission has brought together experts from across the legal profession and will explore establishing access to justice as a fundamental public entitlement. Since 2010, the government has cut legal aid to the bone. The consensus that once existed around legal aid has been sidelined. While we recognise the need to make savings, the National Audit Office, the Public Accounts Committee and the Justice Select Committee have all criticised the government's failure to understand the knock-on costs and wider consequences of its reforms. The Labour Party recognised the importance of legal aid in making sure the state does not infringe upon the liberty of its citizens. And we understand its crucial role as a tool for legal redress in family disputes. Those who traditionally benefit from legal aid, the poor and most vulnerable, have been marginalised by the policies of this government. They have seen the erosion of their rights at work, in schools, as well as in their housing and welfare needs. In 2010, as Labour left office, almost 500,000 cases received advice or assistance for social welfare issues. The year after LASPO came into force, it was less than 53,000. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I'm sure, like me, my honourable friend has constituents in his surgeries every single week desperate for legal help, who previously would have benefited from the legal aid regime, but who now cannot find legal help or representation anywhere, and they cannot afford to pay for it.
My honourable friend makes an absolutely critical point, which is that this is about the kind of society that we want to live in, and there is no doubt that a key indicator of that is the way in which we deal with access to justice. And my constituents, as hers, are deeply concerned by the distortion of our justice system that we're discussing here today. What we have seen is a massive drop, if you look at those figures that I just quoted. And this has had a huge impact on people across England and Wales. These are parents unable to see their children, employees unfairly dismissed or discriminated against, tenants mistreated by abusive landlords, women unable to leave abusive partners. Exactly the kind of people this government claims to be standing up for. But the reality is different. Take family proceedings, for instance. In the first quarter of 2015, 76% of private family law cases had at least one party who was not represented. That means constituents of ours no longer receiving the support and advice that is required for them to have effective redress in the courts. This problem is most acute in the civil and family courts, who are dealing with an unprecedented rise in the number of litigants in person. Previously, litigants in person were most often there by choice, choosing to self-represent. But it is now the case that litigants in person are there because they cannot get legal aid. The Personal Support Unit, which provides help to people who are facing civil court hearings, has seen a rise of 900% in clients helped. The deck is firmly stacked against the most vulnerable, Mr. Chairman. What was once a relatively level playing field has been seriously distorted, with litigants in person now effectively battling uphill, often challenging decisions passed down by the government. The checks and balances that were previously in place for citizens to hold the government to account have been seriously limited. Across the legal spectrum, we have seen the removal of vast swathes of legal aid, the closing down of law centres, the removal of good quality legal advice from those who need it most. And if that wasn't enough, the safeguard of judicial review has also been severely curtailed. We have seen the warm words from the Justice Secretary, who decried a two-nation justice system. But unfortunately, we all know his rhetoric is not being backed up by action. The Justice Secretary has carried on from where his predecessor left off, sidelining legal aid. The sector cut to the bone. Courts closures denying access to local justice and massive increases in fees, excluding many from the system. One particular section of the population in desperate need are victims of domestic violence. The government made a point during the passage of the LASPO bill of saying that it was not their intention to make legal aid available to all victims of domestic violence. The government have been too narrow in the safeguards put in place for ensuring that victims of domestic violence can receive legal aid. The Justice Committee expressed concern in its report about the evidence requirements for victims of domestic violence, and a recent survey from Rights of Women revealed that 39% of respondents did not have the evidence required to qualify for legal aid. Another survey found that almost half of respondents did not take any action in relation to their family law problem because they were unable to apply for legal aid, and a further 25% opted to represent themselves in court. These figures reflect the findings of the APPG for domestic and sexual violence. They found that over 60% of respondents did not commence action, and that 1 in 6 had to pay more than £50 to get the required evidence to prove domestic violence. The victims of domestic violence should not be forced to choose between staying with their abuser or having to face them in court. Whilst we on this side of the House do not believe that this was the government's intention in the legal aid reforms, it is nonetheless one that persists and which must be addressed.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
My honourable friend is raising some very important points about the access, particularly women face, and the barriers to access around legal aid and domestic violence. But women are facing a double barrier to access to justice when it comes to sex discrimination in the workplace as well, where the new employment tribunal fees mean we've seen a huge drop-off in the number of women seeking justice for that.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and she makes an absolutely critical point about women in the workplace. And I think this does play into the broader theme of today's discussion, which is about how we ensure that we include all elements of society so that we can build an economy and a society that is cohesive and dynamic. The issues that we're talking about here today are not just about rights and equalities in the narrow sense of the term. They're about how those rights and equalities play into the creation of an inclusive and dynamic economy where all people are able to bring their talents to the table. And of course, women are absolutely critical element of that. And without this redress to justice, they won't have the checks and balances in place that they need to defend their rights as every other member of society should. So I think we are seeing a very clear theme that's coming through in all of the interventions from my honourable friends and in the overall theme of today's discussion, which is around the question of whether the government has properly considered the impact of its legislation and its policies on some of the most vulnerable groups in society, such as the homeless, those threatened with eviction and serious housing disrepair, those in need of community care services, parents and children involved in child abduction cases, and those with mental health and mental capacity issues. This test only further entrenches the gap between those who can and those who cannot access justice. The law is there to protect all citizens, and a robust justice system should make sure that justice should be afforded to all, not just those who can afford it.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. Last week we had the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, issue his annual report in which he raised concerns directly about lack of access to justice. And Lord Justice Briggs said that to any rational observer who values access to civil justice, this is a truly shocking state of affairs. If we have the most senior judiciary in our country worrying about lack of access to justice, does my honourable friend not agree with me that the government must take heed and must start to change their policies in this arena?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. I agree entirely with it, every word of it, and the sentiment also. Honourable members of this House clearly have a very deep and active interest in the issue we're discussing today, but we could never claim to be experts to the level of the judiciary that my honourable friend just cited. And we must, I think, defer to those views. If the most eminent experts in the world are telling us that the system is seriously flawed, that the new legislation is deeply damaging, we must surely take heed of those interventions. Nothing we see from the government addresses what is increasingly being recognised as a two-nation justice system, and this from the party that claims to be a one-nation party. How we treat the most vulnerable is a key barometer of the kind of society we are and that we aspire to be, in particular when it relates to the most fundamental of rights, that of equality before the law. The reduction in court fees alongside reduced access to legal aid, court fees alongside reduced access to legal aid restricts access to justice. And unless the government changes course, it will fail on the first duty of any government, the just maintenance of law and order. Thank you.